Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And, yeah, we're getting, like, one of the most obvious videos ever out of the way. Look, this had to happen eventually. BT is an artist I've talked about repeatedly on this channel as among my personal favorite artists of all time. I've nearly fully exhausted the topic of his music aside from doing this ranking, and some people have even told me they've gotten sick of my constantly talking about him and praising him, and I can't please everyone, I guess, but exhausting topics is what I do on this channel, and if there's this one format left that I hadn't talked about him yet, we're gonna do it. Obviousness aside, I just want to get this out of my system. I just had this lying around in my Google Drive for ages, not really knowing when I should just finally write it out, record it, and upload it. There never really seemed like a good time. I didn't do it back when I was actually doing my discography review of him a few years ago because I'd smelled a new album on the horizon with his singles like LSTM and Yahweh. And now we technically have that album without said singles having actually made the cut, but whatever. Then I wanted to wait a while and let that album really digest, and then I didn't want this video to overlap too closely with other rankings or videos like the Avalanches and Daft Punk ones. I don't know, but I definitely wanted this video to be a thing at some point because, I mean, BT's catalog is just so varied and interesting and fun for me to break down. And doing a ranking like this would feel like it would actually add something to the conversation that my regular reviews wouldn't necessarily. Also make for an easy point of entry for those looking to get into his stuff and might not be familiar with him already. Might have been interested based on how frequently I talk about him. And I did recently get motivated to finally put this together after seeing and participating in a few, fan rankings of tracks on different BT albums made by one of the usual commenters on this channel. So he was a little more on the forefront of my mind recently, so yeah, here we are. So, yeah, I guess let's just get the usual disclaimers out of the way. As always, this is obviously just my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. None of this is set in stone, and this ranking in particular has actually changed a lot over a very long period of time. But I think my thoughts are just pinned down enough here for me to be ready to just let it all off my chest. Feel free to post in the comments about what your ranking might be and how it might differ from mine. I'm sure there'll be plenty of different takes on his catalog, and I've seen plenty of love for all of his projects. The other thing worth noting is that this ranking only counts his core 13 studio albums. It does not include Electronic Opus for obvious reasons, it does not include any of his film soundtracks, and it does not include his work with All Hail the Silence, just the main BT albums, and that's it. I think there's plenty enough discussion material that selection provides on its own, so, yeah, I think that's all the prelude I got. Let's just get into it. BT, worst to best. At number 13, I have Between Here and You. Yeah, it's kind of a shame because I do think that this project actually has the honor of best album cover for any BT album. Just look at that. That is a really freaking cool album cover. But yeah, the album itself has not actually stuck with me much at all. I remember thinking in my review that this purely ambient side offering could probably work better as a bonus disc attached to a larger and more expansive work, expecting his then upcoming Other Side of Fear album to be that. But that project turned out to be its own separate thing, leaving this project kind of just awkwardly sitting there in his catalog. And I mean, it does definitely have its moments. I still quite like the expansiveness of tracks like Ake Bonica and Chromatography. There's some cool synth rambles like Photosynthetic and Metamorphic. And The Obstacle Is the Way does have a more acoustic edge to it to help it stand out in the track listing, I guess. But none of these tracks would rank among my favorites BT's ever done, or even my favorite of his ambient material. This project mainly just feels kinda derivative and forgettable, and considering he had a different album before this that delivered a lot of similar ideas and had pretty much the exact same overall vibe in Nuovo Merso Sabrosa, signing off as this as anything essential becomes that much harder. I do enjoy myself anytime I put this on. It is very nice background music, but it's not particularly interesting beyond that surface level. It doesn't get more rewarding with more active listening or repeat visits, and it's the only BT album that outright feels redundant to me. There's really nothing here you couldn't already get elsewhere and better, either from BT himself or any number of other ambient artists, so yeah, it's going at the bottom. Whoopsh. At number 12, I have Emotional Technology. Yeah, I know this is kind of already widely considered to be one of BT's weakest projects and often marked down by fans for exploring some of his most commercial pop-heavy material. But this album also has lots of defenders and people willing to stand behind it as some of his best, and I totally get that too. I don't even think it's nearly as bad as so many people say it is either. This album does definitely have a feel to it that none of his other projects do, or anything else in the trance music world for that matter. There's a lot of interesting and creative ideas all over the place. I like how he focused a lot of his efforts on the stutter editing and got it to work in some really cool ways throughout the project, for instance. And even in this project's weakest and trendiest moments, I never got the feeling that BT himself was phoning this in. He definitely really cared about this project just like he would for all his others, and he put his all into it. But it is still one of the projects from him I least frequently return to, and there's a few reasons for that. For one thing, while BT himself did not phone it in at any point, I got the feeling that a lot of his guest features kinda did. I've been told that BT's entire studio was robbed during this album's development. He had to start the project over from scratch and kind of rush things together to meet a deadline. So that might be why I get a vibe off of many of these guest performances, like they're thinking, oh, we gotta do this again. And they end up feeling rather lifeless and bland as a result. But this project's biggest issue isn't the lack of passion in the guest performances or the more commercial focus of the sound. I've said many times before, just because it's a sellout doesn't mean it's bad. And I do in fact think that BT exploring commercial pop did turn out fairly interesting results that actually felt like an expansion of his sound without watering it down. It just so happens to be attached to some of his weakest and least memorable sets of tracks. Somnambulist Simply Being Loved is pretty much the only track on here that's become a big mainstay in the BT catalog for its rock-solid hook and how far down the stutter edit rabbit hole he went while making it. Still a total bop, but also still wouldn't make my personal top 20 favorites from him. There's maybe a few tracks here like Dark Heart Dawning or The Great Escape that can hit on a more emotional level, and I still really like. But there are also quite a few middling rock ballads that show BT trying and failing to recapture the magic of Satellite, despite a few good hooks here and there. There's a bunch of other pop trance cuts that mostly bounce off me without me remembering much of anything about them. And this album also has quite possibly the worst opening 1-2 punch of any BT album, with Guru's completely half-assed fake deep rap verse on Knowledge of Self. That guy could do so much better than that, and he did not need to be on the Mad Skills Mike Check sequel. And the super try-hard cool, but ultimately really dated and lame Super Fabulous. Like, come on, BT really decided to call a track Super Fabulous? Really tells you all you need to know there. I do still put this album on every now and then, since I can feel BT's passion in this one all the way through, and I do really want to like it more. It's not remotely bad at all, and I don't think it comes even close to deserving the level of hate that it's gotten, but it still unfortunately leaves me kinda underwhelmed as a whole, and it's not as easy to recommend to the lay listener when there are just so many other albums in his catalog, both before and after it, that deliver on a lot of similar ideas but pull them off so much better. At number 11, I have Nuovo Morso Subrosa. It's the other straight ambient BT album, the one that actually came first and did these ideas better than Between Here and You, but also one that I don't actually put on very often these days. Again, it's all very nice for what it is, and I do think this album does have a bit more texture and variety and the feeling of a complete unified whole than his second attempt at a straight ambient album. And I also do like the more pretentious modern classical track titling and insistence that the whole thing is supposed to be treated as one single track, despite each of the individual parts being pretty easily distinguishable from each other. Whenever I do actually put this thing on, I do find it legit pretty impressive on how he got such an otherwise simplistic take on the genre to fit so well into his usual style, and remain easily recognizable as something only he would do. And the first 4 segments of this thing are all great. But after the Seraphim segment, it kind of feels like this project just kind of cycles through a few ideas it already went over and ends up feeling like it ran out of steam. And I will freely admit, as generally consistent as this project is and as impressive as it can be in its best moments, it does still have the feeling of a side offering and a detour in BT's catalog. It's not like he's doing anything game-changing here. Any longtime ambient music fans going into this for the first time probably won't find this to be anything all that special in the grander scheme of the genre. And I don't either, which might be why I don't put it on very often. It's definitely a minor entry in his catalog that probably is not essential listening, but it's definitely still worth checking out for anyone curious. At number 10, I have A Song Across Wires. Ooh, I am so conflicted about A Song Across Wires. This is another project of his that wasn't very well received at the time. Still isn't often considered one of his better projects. It was a move for him into just straight up festival EDM. The kind of thing that you could really easily tie to the ongoing scene in 2013. Super trendy stuff that wasn't that great a look for him, and is a really easy project to point to for any of his older fans that stand behind his 90s stuff and think he'd completely lost it beyond that decade. Though at the same time, I also feel like this one's gotten a pretty big reappraisal in the past couple of years. Because as trendy and commercial as it was oddly replayable and grew on a lot of people. And of course that includes me as well. I thought this album was a major letdown when I first heard it, with only 2 tracks worth anything to me at the time. But I kept coming back to it more and more as the years went on, and I now see it as pretty good all around, and certainly light years better than any of the sellout albums his contemporaries in trance music were putting out at the time. The best tracks on this album are among my favorites he's ever done. Skylarking, Must Be the Love, gotta shout out Tomahawk for having been even more of a massive grower since I did my series on him. Also still love City Life and Stem the Tides and how much texture and drive they have, even if those aren't everyone's favorites. Those 5 tracks are all absolute stunners in my eyes, and make the whole album absolutely worth the effort on their own. But this album also has quite a few clunkers and iffy moments. I think Letting Go is so 2013 to the point of not even really sounding like BT anymore. There are a bunch of mediocre cuts in the back half like Surrounded and Calling Your Name, and a pretty underwhelming closer in Lifeline. As a complete whole, it is probably the single biggest mixed bag in BT's whole career, with astronomical heights and very middling lows that just cannot compete. But, it's not like those lows are outright terrible or anything. They're just okay. I mean, I guess if the point I took the most issue with was the otherwise inoffensive Calling Your Name for being a less good remake of an old obscure track he made in the 90s, I think that's a good sign. All my least favorite tracks on here still obviously have their fans as well. So, yeah, if you've got some nostalgia for that particular era of early 2010s EDM at its commercial heights, I think it's definitely worth giving a shot. I can't honestly call this album great or one of his absolute best as a whole, but it does have a lot of individual moments that are his absolute best, and I still keep it around and come back to it quite often. Whoopsh. At number 9, I have Ima. Okay, first of the 90s projects in this ranking. I'm sure I'm about to piss off some older fans by having this project ranked so low. Lots of people have made it clear to me how much this project stood out from the crowd among the ongoing trance scene when this came out in 1995, basically kicking off that whole progressive trance movement that focused itself on so much more refreshing and uplifting summer-y sounds that turned a pretty hard-hitting genre into something that could even be pretty chill and relaxing, while not sacrificing any of its danceability. It's probably the BT project that I have the most respect for purely from a historical context. But that's not to say I don't still have my issues with it. First of all, this is a really weirdly structured album that makes it not really feel like an album much at all. The version I'm used to over there has 3 of his regular singles, 42-minute mix of those singles alongside a bunch of others from around the same time, assembled by Sasha, and one excellent 11-minute closer in Divinity. I always felt like Sasha's Voyage of Ima made the inclusion of the first 3 singles redundant. Like, why do you need just those 3 unmixed when you can have them in a regular mix and it'll work even better? The structuring isn't as weird in the 2-CD version of this album, which has every track in that mix isolated next to the mix itself, as well as some extra tracks in the pretty solid acid trance of Poseidon, and the weirdly out-of-place rock-tinged Blue Skies with Tori Amos, which I'm not really a fan of, but whatever. The trouble with this version of the album, though, is that this selection pads out the running time to well over 2 hours and doesn't even come close to actually having enough different ideas to justify that. I've personally kept around just the Sasha mix and Divinity. I felt like that was enough for me. That's already a 53-minute project for you there, a perfectly reasonable length with no redundant alternate cuts that don't feel like they need to be there, and a lot of great mid-90s dance music with lots of relaxing vibes. maybe the Loving You More segments drag on a bit, but I'm not too bothered by it. I do tend to view this project more as a piece of history than something that I actually feel compelled to come back to very often. A project that, while great for the time, doesn't fully exemplify everything I personally love in BT's music specifically. Plus, I believe his follow-up to this covers a lot of similar territory while feeling way better fleshed out and more like the kind of thing that only he would do. But hey, there are plenty of people out there who have so much stronger an attachment to this project than I do, who that think this is either his truly best work for how well it captures their nostalgia for that era to this day, or even some people who think it's the only project of his even worth your time at all, which, not sure if I want to dignify that, but it is a take some people have. Love it or don't, it's still got a towering legacy behind it. I just think he'd go on to put out a lot better stuff than this. Whoopsh. At number 8, I have The Lost Art of Longing.
Would you blaze in the darkness and embrace the phantom pain?
Alright, the new one. Yeah, so this one's been getting a lot of lukewarm reviews in retrospect, huh? Seems a consensus is starting to be built that this was like a middling disappointment that had none of the heights of BT's previous work, running on too long for its own good, featuring a very blown-out maximal production style that came off weirdly cold and emotionally detached, leading to lots of people getting really hyped when it first dropped, and then general enthusiasm evaporating in the following months. I'll admit, even I am not as hot on it as I was when it first dropped either, but I still marked it as one of my favorite albums of 2020, and I stand by this project being really solid all around. Maybe it is a bit front-loaded, maybe there are a few clunkers like I Will Be Yours, which despite a good melody just gets worse every time I hear it and is now my clear least favorite. Or Windows, which is an unkillable earworm and I really wish had more substance to back itself beyond that. Or Nor Warning Lights, which has officially become this album's equivalent to A Million Stars, in that my personal enjoyment is inversely proportional to how much I expect to enjoy it before I start. Sometimes it's the album's biggest emotional heavyweight, and other times it's a tedious, overbearing headache. I suppose the production on this whole project can, in fact, be a bit overbearing for its own good, and it's got a single worst album cover to date. Really ugly and drab, it makes BT look old and miserable, and even kind of painting the music itself in a bad light. But no, I still think this album's great. I no longer consider it among his most consistent projects. The highlights and lowlights have pretty clearly separated out from each other by this point. But, I mean, the gulf between the best and worst moments is still nowhere near as vast as that on the song Across Wires. The first half of this project has tons of gems like Wildfire and The Light Is Always On, or the epic 80s retrofuturism of Weltanschauung, which are just as great now as when I first heard them. Or Walk Into the Water and The War, which have even significantly grown on me, the latter having lost every bit of its initial cringe factor, and me now even really liking the trap breakdowns. And I already thought Walk Into the Water was fantastic when I first heard it. That one's probably just my favorite cut on the album now. And the second half has a lot of great moments too. Never Odd or Even is excellent. Save Me is BT's best album closer since The Gathering Darkness. And even If I Can Love You Right has grown on me a little too, despite still not being much of a standout. I definitely get that this project wasn't for everyone, but I still think it's one of his better structured albums. The worst parts are still good enough that I don't feel compelled to skip them, even despite the album's massive length. And there's plenty of fantastic cuts on here that still keep me wanting to come back to the whole thing. I guess we'll see how this holds up with a few more years of hindsight. But right now I think it's settled pretty neatly around the middle of this ranking. A great project, but not among his very best. Nothing but gems going upwards from here. Whoopsh. And number 7, I have Underscore. Alright, here we go. Big box thing. BT may be best known for making trance music, but I think the stuff that really sets him apart from the crowd and makes him one of my all-time favorite artists are albums like these that just go off into much more abstract territory. Just do whatever the heck they want without worrying about any kind of wider mainstream appeal. Letting song structures expand outwards and flow all over the place, have tons of IDM glitch fests and beautiful ambient sidetracks. And, you know, sure, there are other artists that have come around since that explore a lot of similar territory, like Triphonic and Elon Moore and Koan Sound and Rob Clouth and plenty of others. But not only does BT feel like he was more of a trailblazer for this specific mix of styles thanks to this binary universe, his particular execution on their and every subsequent installment in his little series of similar albums is still the kind of thing I can only associate with him. he definitely carved out his own lane in electronic music with projects like these. Now, of these more abstract albums, Underscore is admittedly my least favorite thanks to its particularly wonky structure that makes it not feel like a cohesive album at all. It feels like BT put the vast majority of his effort into the 3-track run of Artifacture, Indivism, and Omega, and originally intended for that to be the entire album. Then he tacked on a bunch of much shorter tracks on the front end that aren't even close to as being well fleshed out, as well as 2 much more simplistic ambient pieces on the end. And boy does that make the pacing on this thing feel really awkward. But lack of structuring and cohesiveness aside, that hasn't prevented me from regularly putting on this project and enjoying every single bit of it. Artifacture and Omega are the clear standouts on here and stand as 2 of the best tracks BT ever made. Indivism is really good too, even if not as good as those other 2. And I certainly enjoy all the other additions enough to not want them taken off the album entirely. Maybe the Code of Hammurabi is forgettable and 582 is a pretty underwhelmingly lightweight finish. But Tokyo as an opener grows on me every time I hear it. Lustral and Found in Translation have lots of beautiful sounds in them that still make them worth coming back to. And Chromatophore might be my single favorite straight ambient piece BT ever did. All the rain sound effects and light synth progressions still make such an enveloping atmosphere. This project may be pretty scattershot, but it still gets lots of replay value from me, and it absolutely should not be glossed over. And number 6, I have Everything You're Searching For is on the Other Side of Fear. And speaking of albums in a series of more abstract albums, here's one that's really been sticking with me as of late. While BT may have advertised it to be in the same lineage as this binary universe, Other Side of Fear is a pretty singular, standalone entity in his catalog that isn't that easily comparable to any of his other projects. It's a mix of 16 tracks that are mostly much shorter than those you'd expect on his abstract albums. Some of it tackles similar glitchy IDM territory to those albums, but a lot more of it goes for much more toned-down ambient territory, and gets there with the use of a full live orchestra and choir, several tracks which are that and that alone, as well as lots more solo piano pieces. It's by far the biggest downer of any BT album. Every moment on here carries this strong sense of sadness and loneliness to it that can get me in the mood for that on its own, but doesn't exactly make me feel happier. Which really makes it stick out in his catalog even more, since I typically find BT albums to be a lot more uplifting on average. And this thing may not be perfect by any stretch. I do think this album takes a really long time to get going. I'd say this album's stretch of absolute strongest moments only lasts from the track The Boolean Query to Anchorage, if I'm being generous, or from Orthogonal to Eidos, if I want to be pickier. And the opening and closing stretches of this thing are mostly unremarkable in comparison, save for maybe one extra standout here and there, like the opener or The Day That Half Started. It's definitely not his most consistent project, but it is still a heck of a lot more cohesive and well-paced than Underscore was. None of these tracks feel like they're more important than any other, and they all fit together quite well into the same overarching whole. I guess how much you get into this project depends on how much you like this kind of orchestral and modern classical soundtrack type music. It does not appear to have been everyone's cup of tea, but it's definitely stuck with me longer term. I found it's an excellent album to help me fall asleep to, and even when I'm paying closer attention, it's got lots of the biggest emotional moments in BT's catalog, and can make nearly 80 minutes shoot by as if it was nothing. This was something special. And number 5, I have Movement and Still Life.
Always running down the way, and you're standing there.
Alright, let's now get into some of the projects that BT is best remembered for. Here we have a project that covers so much of what made the late 90s and early 2000s great for trance and breakbeat music. BT doing some of his most versatile work, collaborating with lots of different artists behind the scenes like Hybrid and Tsunami One and Paul Van Dyke and Sasha and more, but still getting everything to fit together really well and delivering so many of his most iconic and memorable tracks like Dreaming and Satellite and Mercury and Solace and Godspeed and Running Down the Way Up and Shame and Never Gonna Come Back Down. There's so much amazing stuff in both versions of the album, and yeah, I do have my issues and preferences with both versions. With the original 99 version over there having a rocky opening stretch but going into delivering some of the best trance music I've ever heard from Mercury and Solace onwards and ending beautifully. while the 2000s US version being slightly better paced and having a few exclusive tracks I wish hadn't been glossed over on the original, despite also insultingly cutting down some of the biggest standouts and not ending with Satellite, which is unforgivable. So as a result of my gripes with each version, I actually put together a custom alternate mix of this album myself for personal use that I think combines the best elements of both. Most of it follows the original UK version over there. I left everything from Dreaming through the end of that version completely unchanged. But since the opening stretch with all the breakbeat elements has a lot of weird hiccups and some lackluster tracks like Ride and the hip-hop phenomenon that I could take or leave, that's the part of the album that I switched around a bit. I made it start with, like, the first minute and a half of Fibonacci sequence, since that track's intro is so freaking cool, and I didn't really know where to fit the rest of the track in without totally overstuffing the album, so I just have that on the side. And instead I have that intro lead into Mad Skillz Mike Checka, since that works great as an opener. The US version had the right idea with its placement, I think. And then that into an extended mix I found of the title track from like a 2-CD special edition, which saved the corny phone message and the dance to the beat, shuffle my feet samples for later and allowed the track to actually focus on its best qualities instead. Then Shame, because I have a soft spot for that one and I didn't want to leave it out. Then Never Gonna Come Back Down and Mercury and Solace. Those two have to flow into each other since they're actually in the same key and tempo despite kicking ass in completely different ways. And then the album continues off as normal from there, as I mentioned. I kind of wish I could share the custom mix I put together since I am legit pretty proud of it and how it resolves pretty much all my biggest issues with the album, but alas, copyright is a thing. In either case, whatever version you happen to go by, with over 2 decades of hindsight, Movement and Still Life is really only starting to cement itself as a classic in this genre. Sometimes a bit on the edgier side of BT sound, sometimes way cleaner and more straightforward, but always containing some of his warmest and liveliest sound mixes and practically custom fit for anyone with early 2000s nostalgia. If the version I put together were the original, then I'd have this project even one more spot higher than in the ranking than it already is. But since I had to personally change it around a lot to get the best possible experience, I decided to put this next one up higher. All I'd want changed with that one was switching to mislabeled track titles. Whoopsh. At number 4, I have If the Stars Are Eternal, So Are You and I. It may be true that once upon a time I used to find this album kinda disappointing and like a not as good companion to this binary universe, but with enough years of having grown on me and having really found a place for it in my life, it's risen a lot higher in my ranking than it used to. Sure, the album evokes a lot of empty open space, there might be some tracks like Hymn 808 and Hikari which aren't that interesting, but it's still got such a freaking nice overarching atmosphere that's both nocturnal and downbeat, but also really refreshing and mood-lifting at the same time. I can get into the semi-creepy IDM excursions of GODT, the heartwarming guitar balladry of Our Dark Garden, the spacious minimal techno of 739, that's a really underrated cut by the way, and of course the complex epicness of the opener and closer, 13 Angels on My Broken Windowsill and The Gathering Darkness. There's so much incredible stuff here that only ages better and better as the years go by, especially the opener. This is yet another abstract and ambient-centric project that no one BT could have possibly made, and he really knocked it out of the park. It just took me a few years to fully realize it. Whoopsh. At number 3, I have ESCM. Anyway, getting back to classic trance projects which exemplify what made the particular era they came out in so good. ESCM, like IMA, is a project that bleeds late 90s. BT's production ideas are still sort of being limited by what technology he has access to in a way that none of his stuff afterwards really was. You can especially tell by the tone of fake house piano he uses, for instance. But the hell, I really like those fake house pianos and think all the dated aspects of this project just add to its charm. This is an album that goes pretty all over the place, touching into the breakbeat of Firewater and Orbitus Terranium, the drum and bass of Memories in a Sea of Forgetfulness and The Road to Lost Withiel, the usual progressive trance of Flaming June and Nectar and Content, ambient house and pop with Remember and Lullaby for Gaia, and plenty more, but all of it seamlessly fits together and creates that perfect chill and uplifting 90s atmosphere that lets this album live up to its full title of Electric Sky Church Music. And this album's only massively grown on me in the years since I reviewed it, since I switched over to the original UK version of the album, which I've come to realize is way better than the US reissue I was used to over there. I mean, yes, the US version has Lullaby for Gaia, and that track is great, but the original has The Road to Lostwithiel, which has since become, like, my gold standard for great atmospheric drum and bass that I bring up as a comparison to similar material all the time. The rougher and longer instrumental version of Love, Peace, and Grease fits in the context of the album a lot better too, and I still think Solar Plexus is pretty out of place. Having this brief moment of loud screaming rock music on an album like this does not really complement the vibe BT was going for. So for my own iPod, I split the difference by replacing that track with Lullaby for Gaia, getting the best of both worlds, and also keeping just that little piano outro on Solar Plexus because that is a nice emotional moment too. But yeah, there's not a weak point or dull moment on this album otherwise. So many great moments that may be a product of their time, but are so effective at the mood they create, as well as focusing on the aspects of this era and genre I most enjoy. This has really only stuck with me as a masterpiece more and more as time has gone on. Absolute freaking stunner of a project. But now we're through all that, let's finish with the two most obvious topics you probably saw coming a mile away. Whoopsh. At number 2, I have These Hopeful Machines. Yeah, I've gone on and on many times over the years about this album and it being one of my favorites of all time. One of the albums that's formed such an insanely deep personal connection with me and become my favorite trance album ever. I suppose I have started to better understand where this album's critics have been coming from in more recent years. It is, for instance, a very 2010 sort of album that's extremely commercial, even got Grammy nominated for crying out loud. I mean, all those people who have their nostalgia centered on BT's 90s work like ESCM and Movement and Still Life, and subsequently got really let down by Emotional Technology, they probably saw this album, that it was also kind of trendy for the time, was still hanging on to the commercial pop rock stuff he was doing last time, and even a more radio-friendly blend of it than before. They probably just went like, nah, he's lost it, and decided not to look back again. But obviously that's not remotely my experience. First of all, BT's trance albums, even from the very beginning, have been a product of the time they were released, inextricably tied to their specific era of trance music or electronic music in general. But that also really worked to BT's benefit on this particular album because it reintroduced him to a younger generation of electronic music fans, such as myself, and really got him to connect with that crowd as he mixed trance with the ongoing up-and-coming modern dubstep scene. And more importantly, this album just has some of the best tunes he's ever had to his name. Suddenly, The Emergency, Every Other Way, The Light and Things, Forget Me, Les Nocturnes de Lumière, The Unbreakable, so many tracks here stretch on for super long, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 minutes, and makes use of every single minute with tons of amazing change-ups and sidetracks into different genres and sounds, but never sacrificing the core tunes or trance grooves, delivering emotional gut punch after emotional gut punch, creating one transcendental experience after another, and he just doesn't miss. Maybe there are a few tracks which are only really good to great in the second half instead of incredible. See Always, or Love Can Kill You, or the Ghost in You cover, or A Million Stars, which, as I alluded to earlier, seems to alternatively grow and shrink on me with each listen. I really want to love it as much as the others, since Kirsty Hawkshaw is an absolute treasure, but that one does maybe kind of drag a little. But even these tracks are all really freaking good, and the album as a whole definitely does not drag. It may stretch on for over 100 minutes, but it feels like it's half that length, since there's just so much incredible stuff in every second of this project. But of course, my number one pick is not something you can just tie to any one genre or period of time, doesn't need to rely on poppy hooks or trendy production, it is just its own thing, and it's exactly the one you think it is. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have This Binary Universe. I mean, of course the album I rated a perfect 10 out of 10 goes at the top. Was it ever gonna be anything else? But yeah, I have nothing but pure abject praise for every single little detail and aspect of This Binary Universe. I can't think of even the slightest possible criticism to level at it. I suppose there's one album in existence that I enjoy more than it because Orbitals Insides is a part of my childhood and I didn't first hear this until I was in high school. I suppose the track CUM The Other Side is slightly less technically impressive than the other 6 tracks here and gets a bit repetitive, but even there, it's not like I ever got sick of the sounds it's explored over its 14 minutes, or I couldn't stay in that moment it created for an additional 14 minutes beyond that or even longer. This album is about as close to perfect as an album can get for me. Each of the 7 tracks on here is just packed with so much detail and texture, mixing IDM and ambient and symphonic music and even jazz and rock and so much else. Each track makes perfect use of its extended lengths with lots of change-ups and detours, never feels too drawn out, lets any idea go underdeveloped, but also feels super emotionally charged all the way through. None of it feels like technical achievements for its own sake. All these tracks still have tunes that I can still easily remember in spite of how strange and abstract they are. None of it is trendy or feels attached to any specific moment in time. It is just its own standalone thing that you can't compare to anything else. If BT decided to just ditch trance entirely and only make albums like this for the rest of his career, which probably won't happen, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind doing, I'd be 100% on board for that. But no matter how many more abstract IDM albums he puts out, as great as they may be, I don't think he or anyone else is ever going to be able to top this. So yeah, this Binary Universe is my favorite BT album. Because of course it is, you already knew that. And yeah, that's the ranking. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.